The scissors were cold. Naomi felt them before she heard them, the sharp metal pressing against the back of her neck like a whispered threat. Then came the sound, a single, deliberate snick, and 30 inches of her grandmother's legacy hit the marble floor. Celeste Whitmore stood there holding the scissors, not shaking, not hesitating, smiling. 72 people watched in silence. Not one of them moved. And Naomi, who had covered their shifts, remembered their children's names, stayed late so they could go home early, stood completely still in the middle of that ballroom, and made a decision that would bring an empire to its knees. If that had been you, would you have walked out, or would you have stayed? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if something in this hits you, leave a like. Now, let's begin. Naomi Brooks had a system. It wasn't written down anywhere. There was no binder, no spreadsheet, no color-coded calendar pinned to a corkboard in the break room. The system existed entirely inside her head, a living, breathing map of the Vincenzo estate and the 214 people who moved through it every single day. She knew that Marcus, the head of overnight security, drank his coffee at exactly 4:47 in the morning because that was the moment his shift got loneliest. She knew that Rosa, who cleaned the East Wing bathrooms, had a daughter with asthma and kept a backup inhaler in the third drawer of the housekeeping cart because she was terrified of the day she'd forget it. She knew that the executive chef, a proud man named Bernard, refused to admit he was slightly colorblind and needed someone to quietly confirm whether the garnish on a plating looked right before service. Not because he asked for help, but because he'd once mentioned it offhand during a panic, and Naomi had simply never forgotten. She noticed everything. She remembered everything. She said nothing about any of it. That was the system. For 4 years, Naomi had worked inside the walls of the Vincenzo estate. The Maid, officially listed in the employee records as a Level 3 housekeeping associate, which meant she was responsible for a rotating schedule of interior rooms, linen management, and surface cleaning in the residential quarters. That was her job. That was what she was paid to do. What she actually did was something else entirely. The estate sprawled across 11 acres of private land along the Connecticut coast, 40 minutes outside of New Haven. It wasn't just a home. It was a compound, a fortress disguised as old money. There were 17 residential suites, 4 full commercial kitchens, a ballroom that seated 300, 2 swimming pools, an underground parking structure, a medical bay, and a security operations center that Naomi was technically never supposed to be near, but she'd been near it plenty of times. Because once, 18 months ago, she'd noticed that the overnight shift supervisor was falling asleep at his post, not out of laziness, but because he was caring for a newborn alone after his wife left, and she'd quietly begun leaving thermoses of coffee outside the door every night at 2 in the morning without ever telling a single person she'd done it. Nobody asked her to. That was the thing about Naomi. Nobody ever asked her to do most of what she did. She was 34 years old, a plus-size black woman with warm brown eyes, and the kind of laugh that made people feel like whatever they'd just said was the most interesting thing she'd heard all week. She wasn't particularly imposing. She wasn't the kind of person who filled a room when she walked in. In a place built around power, around men who filled rooms on purpose, who wanted to be noticed, who needed to be feared, Naomi was functionally invisible. She had known that from the very first week. The first week she'd been assigned to clean the third-floor guest suites, and she'd discovered that the previous cleaning rotation had been missing the tops of door frames for at least 6 months. She cleaned them without commenting. She also noticed that the housekeeper assigned to the room beside her, an older Haitian woman named Danielle, who'd been at the estate for 11 years, was secretly struggling with her knees, wincing every time she bent down, moving slower than her schedule allowed, terrified of being let go because she needed the insurance for her husband's dialysis. Naomi split her own assignments that week to absorb Danielle's floor-level work. She told Danielle she was just practicing a new technique. Danielle looked at her for a long moment and said nothing. Then she handed Naomi a piece of her wife's rum cake the following Monday, and they never spoke about it directly again. That was how Naomi moved through the world, sideways, quietly, leaving things better than she found them and never once advertising that she'd been there. The man who owned all of this, the estate, the business, the carefully maintained illusion of legitimacy, was Luciano De Luca. Naomi had a complicated relationship with the way she understood Luciano. She wasn't naive. She'd known from the first week what kind of household she was working in. The kind where certain conversations stopped when she entered a room. The kind where men in expensive suits arrived at odd hours, carrying nothing and leaving faster than they came. The kind where the security protocols were not standard private residence protocols, where the cameras ran on independent servers, where the medical bay was stocked for things beyond routine household accidents. She wasn't stupid. She simply didn't ask questions that weren't hers to ask. What she did know about Luciano De Luca, from direct experience, not rumor, was this. He was meticulous. He had an eye for disorder that rivaled her own, though his manifested differently. Where Naomi's attention moved toward people, his moved toward systems. He could walk into a room and know in 30 seconds if something was off. A chair at the wrong angle, a schedule that didn't align, an energy among his staff that indicated something had gone sideways. He noticed details the way generals notice terrain. He'd noticed her, exactly once, in a way that mattered. It was 18 months into her tenure, during a week when the estate was hosting back-to-back events for Luciano's business associates. Naomi had been working 22 hours without a formal break, not because anyone forced her to, but because the scheduling had collapsed after 2 staff members called out sick, and she'd absorbed the gaps without asking permission. At 3 in the morning, she was alone in the kitchen, eating a piece of bread over the sink, because it was the first moment she'd had to stop moving. Luciano walked in. I was still in his suit, no jacket, shirt sleeves rolled, the look of a man who also hadn't stopped. He looked at her for a moment, looked at the bread, looked at the dark circles she couldn't conceal. He said, "When did you last have an actual meal?" She told him it had been a while. He didn't make a speech. He didn't say anything particularly profound. He simply opened the refrigerator, his own refrigerator, in his own kitchen, and made her a plate. Leftover pasta, some cheese, a handful of olives. Set it on the counter beside her, poured a glass of water. Then he sat down on the opposite stool and ate a plate of the same thing himself, and they sat in silence for about 11 minutes, and he asked her one question before he left. "Are you all right?" And she said yes, because she always said yes, and he nodded like he almost believed her, and he went back to work. She thought about that night sometimes, not because it was romantic. It wasn't, not even a little. It was just the first time in 18 months that someone in that house had looked at her and seen a person rather than a function. She thought about it, and then she filed it away, and she kept doing her job. Celeste Whitmore arrived at the Vincenzo estate 6 months later. She arrived the way most powerful things arrive, suddenly, thoroughly, and with the immediate implication that everything that existed before her was slightly insufficient. She was 31, blonde, and assembled with the kind of precise perfection that money can buy and discipline can maintain. Her family had been in Connecticut politics for 3 generations. Her father was a senator. Her uncle had once been considered for a cabinet position. She had grown up in rooms where power was the wallpaper, so familiar she no longer noticed it, which meant she also no longer noticed when she was reaching for it reflexively. She was not, in the beginning, cruel. Naomi was careful about that particular memory because she understood that oversimplifying a person was its own kind of dishonesty. In the beginning, Celeste was demanding and occasionally dismissive, but that description fit about 40% of the wealthy people Naomi had worked for over the years. She had sharp opinions about the way the estate should be run. She had ideas about restructuring the domestic staff's reporting hierarchy. She used the word inefficient frequently and seemed to believe it was a compliment to herself when she said it. But she wasn't cruel. Not yet. The shift happened slowly, the way most dangerous shifts happen, through accumulation rather than explosion. It started with small moments. Celeste asking Naomi to redo a room that had already passed inspection, watching her face carefully afterward, as though searching for a reaction. Naomi gave her none, just thanked her for the feedback and returned to redo the room. Celeste reassigning Naomi from her regular rotation to lower status cleaning tasks without explanation and watching, again, for the reaction. Naomi thanked her, requested confirmation in writing per estate protocol, and completed the reassigned work. Each non-reaction seemed to frustrate Celeste more than open defiance would have. What Celeste was looking for, Naomi understood this, eventually, was evidence of a threat. She had decided, somewhere in the private territory of her own insecurity, that Naomi was a problem. She had watched Luciano's quiet respect toward his maid, had seen the way staff members smiled when Naomi walked into a room, had heard her name mentioned too many times in conversations that had nothing to do with housekeeping, and she had constructed a story around it. The story was wrong, but it was Celeste's story, and she believed it completely. So she looked for proof. And when she couldn't find proof, she looked harder. And when looking harder didn't work, she began constructing situations designed to expose what she was certain was already there. Naomi was aware of all of this. She was not a woman who missed subtext. She made a choice, early on, to refuse the bait. Not because she was passive, not because she didn't have opinions or feelings about what was happening. She had plenty of both. But she had spent 34 years being a black woman in spaces built for other kinds of people, and she had learned, expensively, through real experience, not theory, that there are battles you fight and battles you document, and that the difference between the two is strategy, not weakness. So she kept doing her job. She kept helping her coworkers. She kept the system running. She wore her hair pinned up during work hours, all 30 inches of it, thick and natural and dark, coiled and secured with pins every morning in the small mirror above her locker in the staff changing room. Her hair was the one vanity she allowed herself without apology. She'd grown it since she was 19, since the year after her grandmother, Ida Mae Brooks, died and left her with nothing except the memory of how Ida Mae used to braid it on Sunday mornings, humming to herself, her arthritis-stiffened fingers still somehow gentle. Naomi's hair was not a style choice. It was a relationship she was still having. Nobody at the Vincenzo estate knew that. Why would they? The night everything broke started 3 weeks before Luciano left for Chicago. There was a diplomatic banquet, 64 guests, a formal dinner requiring 3 simultaneous service rotations, a seating arrangement that had been approved 3 weeks in advance, and then quietly modified by 2 separate department heads who didn't know the other had modified it. The result was a seating chart that placed 2 men whose families had a documented and public history of political and financial animosity spanning nearly a decade, directly beside each other at the head table. Naomi noticed it while cross-referencing the final table layout against the guest dossiers that were routinely circulated to senior staff for ambient awareness. She wasn't supposed to be reading them closely. They weren't strictly within her responsibilities, but she'd formed the habit of scanning them years ago because she'd once averted an accidental insult when she'd learned a guest had a recently deceased mother, and nobody had thought to brief the kitchen staff on why a celebratory cake might be inappropriate. She spotted the seating error at 4:15 in the afternoon, approximately 3 hours before service. She went to Celeste. She found her in the sitting room adjoining the main ballroom, reviewing something on a tablet, her assistant hovering 2 steps behind her with the expression of a person who had learned to make themselves very small. Naomi stood in the doorway. She'd learned not to enter rooms without an invitation from Celeste. Another small accommodation in the long list of small accommodations. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. There's something about the seating arrangements I think you should know." Celeste looked up. The look was not particularly welcoming. "The arrangements were finalized yesterday." "Yes, I know, but 2 changes were submitted separately by logistics and by the reception coordinator, and they weren't reconciled. I think the result has put Mr. Altieri and Mr. Bianchi at adjacent seats." Celeste set down her tablet. "Are you telling me how to manage a formal dinner, Naomi?" The way she said the name, like a small, pointed object. "No, ma'am. I'm flagging a possible conflict in the seating data. You can verify it with the coordinator. I approved those arrangements personally." "Yes, ma'am. The changes may have come through after your approval." There was a beat of silence. Celeste picked up her tablet again. "I'll have someone look into it." She never looked into it. Naomi knew she wouldn't, so Naomi went, quietly, to the reception coordinator herself and confirmed the conflict, and the coordinator, a nervous young man named Philip, who'd been at the estate for 8 months, immediately began making calls. By 5:30, the seating had been silently corrected. During the dinner itself, nobody mentioned it. The event ran smoothly. The guests departed satisfied. But afterward, one of the senior managers, a man named Gerald, who'd been at the estate for 12 years and had a territorial relationship with compliments, found out what had happened and said loudly in the staff corridor while at least a dozen people were present that Naomi Brooks had apparently saved the evening before it started. Celeste was 4 feet away when he said it. The look on her face lasted only a second, but Naomi saw it. And so did several other people who happened to be watching, because Celeste's face in that second was not the face of a woman who was annoyed. It was the face of a woman who had already decided on a consequence. The consequence came 4 days later. Luciano left for Chicago on a Tuesday morning. His motorcade pulled out of the estate gates at 6:45, and by 7:15 Celeste had convened what she called an operational restructuring meeting in the main conference room. It was attended by all department heads. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When people emerged from it, they looked like people who had just been through something they were still processing. The changes were immediate and total. Celeste took direct oversight of all domestic operations. Every decision above a certain threshold required her personal approval. Department heads who had operated with significant autonomy for years were now required to submit daily reports. Communication between departments that had previously been informal and fluid was now supposed to be routed through a centralized channel that Celeste controlled. Within 48 hours, the estate began running slower. Within 72 hours, it began running into walls. Naomi watched all of this happen with a very particular kind of stillness, the kind that comes not from peace, but from recognition. She'd seen versions of this before, but smaller versions, in smaller places, and she knew exactly what it looked like when a system that ran on trust and informal collaboration was suddenly forced to route everything through a bottleneck. She kept helping people. She kept filling the gaps. She kept absorbing the problems that the new structure was creating and solving them quietly before they could become visible crises. She told herself it was just until Luciano got back. 1 week. She could carry this for 1 more week. She was wrong about the week, but she was also wrong about something else. Something she wouldn't understand until later, when she had time to look back at the sequence of events and see the pattern she'd missed while she was living through it. She'd assumed that Celeste's hostility was about power. A woman asserting herself in a space she felt uncertain in, overcompensating, causing collateral damage without meaning to. But the night of the second staff dinner, a Wednesday, 5 days after Luciano's departure, she understood that she'd gotten that part wrong. It wasn't about power, not exactly. It was about her. The second dinner was smaller than the first, an internal event, really, a standing Wednesday gathering for senior domestic staff that had been a tradition at the estate for years. Naomi attended because she had always attended, and because she genuinely enjoyed it. She'd sat at the same spot near the middle of the table for 3 years, and people had slowly migrated around her until that spot became, unofficially, the center of gravity at the gathering. Not because she commanded it, but because she made people comfortable and conversation was easier when you were near someone who listened well. Celeste arrived 20 minutes late. She hadn't attended these dinners before. She sat at the head of the table. She watched. For the whole dinner, she watched. And specifically, Naomi noticed, with the kind of careful, quiet attention she gave to things that mattered. She watched the way people talked to Naomi, the way they leaned toward her when they spoke, the way they laughed a little harder at her responses. Near the end of the dinner, there was a moment. The head chef, Bernard, was describing a mistake he'd made early in his career, a self-deprecating story about a collapsed soufflé at a very important event. And he looked across the table at Naomi halfway through and said, "You would have laughed at me." And Naomi said, "I would have helped you first and then laughed at you." And the whole table laughed. And it was the kind of easy, genuine laugh that can't be manufactured. Celeste didn't laugh. She smiled. A smile that had nothing behind it. Naomi felt the back of her neck prickle and didn't know why. 3 days later, she would know. 3 days later, Celeste Whitmore would walk into the ballroom during a late evening event, cross a room full of 72 watching people, reach up behind Naomi without a word of warning, and the scissors would be cold, and 30 inches of Naomi's grandmother would hit the marble floor, and Naomi would stand completely still in that terrible silence and make a decision. Not the one anyone expected, not the one Celeste expected, the kind of decision that doesn't make noise when it happens, the kind that simply takes root, deep and quiet, and waits. The scissors were still in Celeste's hand. That was the first thing Naomi registered when the sound stopped. Not the cold air against the back of her neck where the hair used to be. Not the collective inhale of 72 people who had all stopped breathing at exactly the same moment. Not even the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her chest like something physical. The first thing she registered was that Celeste was still holding them. open, loose in her fingers, like she hadn't decided yet whether she was finished. Naomi didn't move. She stood in the center of the ballroom floor with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and she breathed. One breath in, one breath out, slow enough that nobody watching could tell how hard that was. The hair lay on the marble in front of her, 30 inches. Dark and thick and curled at the ends, the way it always curled when it wasn't pinned. It didn't look real, separated from her head like that. It looked like something from a costume shop, like a prop from a story about someone else's life. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she held out her hand toward Celeste. "Give me the scissors." Her voice came out level. Not soft, not loud, just level. The same register she used when she was telling Bernard the garnish colors were off, or telling Marcus that his patrol rotation had a gap at the north gate. Functional, clear. Celeste blinked. Whatever reaction she had prepared for, tears probably, or anger, or the quiet collapse of a woman who understood she had lost. This wasn't it. She looked down at the scissors in her own hand like she'd briefly forgotten they were there. She held them out. Naomi took them. The metal was warm now from Celeste's grip. She reached up and found the uneven edge of what remained, the rough, hacked line, where 30 inches had become maybe 2, ragged on one side and longer on the other. She felt it with her fingers the way you feel the edge of a wound. Carefully, clinically, determining the extent of the damage before deciding what to do about it. Then she began cutting. Not fast, not dramatically, just steadily, working around her own head by feel, evening out what Celeste had started. Small, deliberate cuts. The remaining pieces fell one by one onto the marble, joining the pile already there, and the ballroom stayed completely, absolutely silent the entire time. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved toward her. Nobody moved away. When she was done, she lowered the scissors. She ran one hand across the back of her neck, 2 inches of natural curl, even now, even under these circumstances, already beginning to spring back into its shape. She took one more breath. She looked at Celeste. Celeste was staring at her with an expression Naomi had never seen on her face before. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something closer to unease. The expression of a person who has thrown a stone expecting a specific kind of splash and instead got silence. Naomi said quietly and without heat, "You just made a mistake you'll never understand." Then she set the scissors down on the nearest serving table, picked up the cleaning cloth from her apron pocket, and went back to work. She refilled water glasses. She cleared a bread plate. She did not look at Celeste again. The room began to breathe. It took about 4 minutes for the noise to return to the ballroom. Conversation resuming in fragments, people looking at their plates, a few forced laughs. The particular social performance of pretending something enormous hadn't just happened in front of everyone. Naomi moved through it all like a current through still water, steady, consistent, present. But she was also cataloging. She noticed which staff members looked at her directly and which ones looked away. She noticed that Philip, the reception coordinator, had gone pale and was gripping his clipboard so tightly his knuckles had changed color. She noticed that Danielle, who was stationed near the East service doors, had tears running down her face that she was making no effort to wipe, as though she'd given up on the idea of hiding them. She noticed that Gerald, the senior manager who'd complimented her seating catch 5 days ago, the one Celeste had been 4 feet from when it happened, had left the room entirely. She noticed all of it and stored it and kept moving. Celeste retreated to the far end of the room and stood with her assistant, a woman named Trish, who communicated primarily through small, anxious adjustments to whatever was nearest her. Her tablet, her collar, her hair. Celeste was speaking to her in a low voice. Trish was nodding in the specific way of someone who has stopped processing the actual words and is just keeping pace with the rhythm. The banquet concluded at 10:47. Naomi was among the last staff members to leave the ballroom. She collected forgotten items from table surfaces, a phone, a pair of reading glasses in a case, a small jewelry pouch someone had left beside their water glass. She set them in the lost and found box at the service entrance. She turned off the secondary lights on the east wall. She checked that the kitchen pass-through was secured. She did all of it on autopilot while the larger part of her brain was doing something entirely different. She was deciding, not whether to stay or leave. She'd already made that decision, standing in the middle of the ballroom with scissors in her hand. Leaving wasn't the answer. Leaving was what Celeste wanted. It would have confirmed whatever story she'd told herself about Naomi being a threat that had to be eliminated. Leaving would have made Celeste the winner of something Naomi refused to let become a competition. So she wasn't deciding whether to stay. She was deciding what staying was going to look like now. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't a dramatic statement, it was just true. She lay in her small apartment in the staff residential wing of the estate, which was a generous description for a room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out at the side of the equipment shed, and she stared at the ceiling for most of the night. Not crying, not spiraling, just awake in the particular way of someone who is trying to be honest with themselves about something they don't entirely want to face. She'd given a lot to this place, more than her job description, more than her paycheck accounted for. More, honestly, than was smart. She knew that. She'd always known it, in the abstract way you know things about yourself that you're not quite ready to do anything about. She told herself it was because she liked the people. And she did, genuinely, most of them. She told herself it was because she cared about doing things well. And she did, that too. But in the long, quiet honesty of 3 in the morning, she acknowledged the third reason. The one she liked least. She had made herself indispensable because indispensable felt like safe. It felt like the opposite of disposable. And she had spent enough of her life in enough situations feeling like the latter that she had built her entire professional identity around never feeling it again. That strategy had just cost her 30 inches of hair and a piece of her grandmother she was never getting back. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, held it there. She thought about Ida May, about Sunday mornings in the small kitchen in Augusta, about the smell of the pressing comb heating on the stove, even though later, when Naomi was older, her grandmother had let the natural texture grow and learned a new language for it, the oils and the wide-tooth combs, and the Sunday morning ritual that changed in form but never in feeling, hands in her hair, patient, humming something without words. She didn't cry. She wasn't going to cry about it tonight, in this narrow bed, in this room that wasn't really hers. She would grieve the hair, but not here, not like this. She made her decision somewhere around 4:15, in the dark, with the equipment shed casting its square shadow across her window. She was going to come to work in the morning. She was going to perform every task outlined in her employment contract with absolute precision. She was going to be completely professional, completely present, and completely correct. And she was going to stop, not stop working, stop giving. There was a difference, a very specific, very important difference. And she spent the remaining hours before dawn drawing the line between them in her mind with great care. Morning came gray and damp, a Connecticut October morning with fog sitting low over the grounds and the smell of something going soft in the leaves. Naomi was in the staff kitchen at 6:15 making her coffee. She was wearing her uniform. Her hair, what remained of it, was washed and shaped as best she could manage it, 2 inches of dense natural curl that she'd smoothed with the edge of a wide-tooth comb. She looked fine. She had decided, sometime in the pre-dawn, that she was going to look fine, and she did. Marcus came in at 6:22. He saw her and stopped. He was a large man, Marcus, broad through the shoulders, heavy-footed, the kind of person whose movements announced to him in rooms before he arrived. But right now he stopped like he'd walked into a wall. "Naomi," he said. "Morning, Marcus." She poured her coffee. "Your thermos is on the second shelf. I restocked the coffee pods. I heard what happened last night." "You probably heard right." She added the specific amount of creamer she always added, 2 teaspoons. She stirred it. "You want eggs?" "I'm making some." "Naomi." "Marcus." She looked at him directly. "I'm fine. What I'm not is looking for a conversation about it at 6 in the morning. You want eggs or not?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who has something to say and is trying to figure out if the person he wants to say it to actually wants to hear it. "I should have done something," he said. "Last night, I was right there. I should have—" "You had a room full of guests and an unclear situation and a split second," she said. "I know what you were calculating. I'm not mad at you." "You should be." She cracked 2 eggs into the pan. "Maybe, but I'm not." She glanced at him. "The eggs are coming whether you answer or not." He sat down. He didn't say anything else for a while. She made eggs for both of them, and they ate standing at the counter because neither of them felt like sitting, and then Marcus picked up his thermos and his radio, and he paused at the door. "Whatever you're thinking about doing," he said, "whatever you decided last night, I want you to know that I think you should do it." She raised her eyebrows. "You don't know what I decided?" "No," he said, "but I know you. And I think whatever it is, it's been a long time coming." He left. Naomi washed the pan. By 9 o'clock, Celeste had issued 3 memos. They arrived via the internal communication system. Brief, official, formatted with the estate letterhead that Celeste had apparently requested be applied to all her directives. The memos covered, respectively, a new mandatory check-in protocol for all level 3 and below housekeeping staff, a revised cleaning rotation that redistributed Naomi's assignments across 3 other maids without removing anything from her workload, and a new rule requiring that any proactive communications from domestic staff to guests or visiting management be approved by Celeste's office 24 hours in advance. That last one was aimed at her. Naomi understood the targeting without requiring confirmation. She read all 3 memos. She sent a formal acknowledgement to each one, a brief, correct professional response noting receipt and compliance. Then she went to her first assigned room and began her work. She cleaned the room. She cleaned it thoroughly, correctly, and to the precise standard outlined in the estate's housekeeping protocol documentation. She changed the linens. She restocked the amenities. She cleaned the fixtures. She performed exactly the task she was contracted and paid to perform. She did not, while she was in that room, notice that the guest in Suite 7 had a peanut allergy that wasn't in their dietary file because they'd mentioned it casually to Naomi 2 months ago during a conversation about a different topic entirely. She did not go to the kitchen and quietly update Bernard's pre-service briefing sheet. She didn't not notice. She noticed. She noticed the way she always noticed, the same automatic cataloging that she'd been doing for 4 years, the information landing in her mind with the same quiet efficiency it always had. She just didn't act on it. She moved to the next room. At 11:30, Philip found her in the east corridor. He'd been looking for her for 40 minutes, she could tell. He had the slightly desperate, rumpled look of someone who'd been walking fast for a while. His clipboard was clutched to his chest like it was keeping him upright. "Naomi." He stopped, slightly breathless. I have a situation." She stopped, turned to face him. "What kind of situation?" "The Hartwell part. They're arriving Thursday instead of Saturday. I just got the confirmation, it came in this morning, and the room assignments are completely wrong. The suite they were booked into is already committed to the Richardson group, and I need to restructure the entire 4th floor rotation, and I don't have—" He stopped. "I don't know how to fix this without it becoming a problem." She looked at him for a moment. 2 weeks ago, she would have already been moving. She would have pulled the 4th floor occupancy chart from memory, identified 2 workable solutions, and told Philip which one to implement while she handled the communication to the affected parties. She would have had it sorted before lunch. She said, "That's a scheduling conflict. You'll want to take it to Celeste's office for approval before you make any changes." Philip stared at her. "The approval window is 24 hours minimum. The Hartwells arrive in 48. "I know." "Naomi." "Philip." She kept her voice even, not unkind. "I'm a level 3 housekeeping associate. Scheduling conflicts above my clearance level go through the current management structure. That's Celeste's office." He stared at her. She watched him understand what was happening, watched it move through his face in stages, the confusion first, then the dawning, then something more complicated. "This is because of last night," he said. "This is because of my job description," she said. He kept staring. "I'll tell you this," she said, and she kept her voice low and her tone careful. "Document every step, every communication, every timestamp. If this becomes a problem, you want a paper trail that shows exactly who was responsible for what decision." She turned and went back to her work. Philip stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she heard his footsteps going toward the administrative wing. By 2 in the afternoon, the first crack appeared. It started in the kitchen, Bernard's domain, his empire, the one space in the estate where he was entirely sovereign, and he knew it. The Wednesday lunch service for senior resident staff was a smaller affair than the banquet dinners, but it required the same precision. 14 specific dietary needs across 22 people, a rotating menu that intersected with a list of preferences and restrictions that had taken Naomi about 8 months to fully catalog. She was not at the kitchen during pre-service prep. She was cleaning the guest bathrooms on the 3rd floor. At 2:12, she heard the kitchen alarm from 2 floors away. the sharp triple beep of the intercom being keyed multiple times in quick succession, which was Bernard's signal for a situation. She didn't go downstairs. She recocked the area around the third-floor north bathroom faucet, which had been on her list for 2 weeks, and which she had kept deferring because something more urgent always seemed to come up. Today, nothing came up. Today, she had time to caulk the faucet. At 2:40, Danielle appeared in the doorway of the bathroom with a look on her face like she'd been running. "Bernard served peanut sauce," Danielle said. Naomi kept her eyes on the faucet. "Is everyone all right?" "Marguerite had her EpiPen. She's fine, but she's shaken up, and Bernard is—" "Naomi, he's in the kitchen right now, and he can't figure out how it happened because the allergy wasn't in the file." "It should be in the file," Naomi said. "It wasn't." "Then someone needs to update the file." She pressed the caulk into the edge of the seal and smoothed it. "That's the Dietary Records Coordinator's responsibility. Bernard should flag it to them directly." Danielle stared at her. She was 61 years old, Danielle, and she had a face that had never learned to hide what it was thinking. Right now it was thinking several things at once, and most of them were directed at Naomi with a kind of worried intensity that Naomi felt without looking at. "You knew," Danielle said, not accusing, just stating. Naomi said nothing. "You knew about Marguerite's peanuts." "I know a lot of things about a lot of people," Naomi said. "That information should be in the official records. If it's not in the records, then the records are incomplete, and that's a records management issue." "Naomi, Danielle." She finally looked up. "Is Marguerite all right?" "Yes." Then the situation was handled. She held Danielle's gaze for a moment, steady. "I'm going to finish this faucet and then move to the linen rotation. If you need me for something in my job description, I'll be on the third floor for another 20 minutes. Danielle looked at her for a long time. Then she looked down at the floor. When she looked back up, there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite anger. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. "I'm not angry at you," she said quietly. "I want you to know that." "I know," Naomi said. And she meant it. Danielle left. Naomi went back to the faucet. She did not feel good. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, internally, where it mattered. She did not feel righteous or satisfied or vindicated. Marguerite was fine. That was the only part she'd held on to, the part she'd monitored remotely with the particular low-grade vigilance of someone who has drawn a line and needs to know they've drawn it in the right place. But she didn't feel good. She felt tired. She felt the specific, bone-level tired of someone who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has just set it down and is now discovering that setting it down doesn't feel like relief. It feels like absence, like the echo of a weight. She finished the faucet. She gathered her materials. She moved to the linen rotation. At 4:15, Celeste came to find her. Naomi was in the second-floor linen closet, working through the restock inventory. When she heard the heels on the corridor floor, the specific cadence of Celeste's walk, fast and deliberate, the walk of a woman who had decided something on the way over and hadn't talked herself out of it yet. The closet door opened. Celeste stood in the doorway. She was still put together. She was always put together. But something around her eyes had tightened in the way things tighten when a day has gone differently than planned. "I need to talk to you," Celeste said. "Of course." Naomi set down the stack of pillowcases she was counting. She turned to face her, hands loose at her sides. Nothing on her face that was confrontational and nothing that was submissive, just present. "There was an incident at lunch." "I heard. I'm glad Marguerite is all right." "You knew about her allergy." Naomi let a beat pass. "I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of staff members and guests over the years. Some of what I learned should have been formally documented. I'd suggest a full audit of the dietary records would be a good next step." Celeste looked at her. "That's not what I asked." "You said there was an incident. I'm suggesting a constructive response to it." "I'm asking whether you deliberately withheld information." The word deliberately landed in the space between them and sat there. Naomi held Celeste's gaze. She made sure her breathing was steady. She made sure her hands stayed still. And she said, with complete calm, "I performed my duties today in full compliance with my job description and the communications protocols outlined in this morning's memos." Something moved across Celeste's face. It was quick, controlled almost immediately. But Naomi saw it. Rage, clean and hot, and underneath it something that Naomi recognized with a precision that surprised her. Fear. Not fear of Naomi exactly, fear of what the day had demonstrated. Fear of what it meant that one level 3 housekeeping associate, doing nothing except exactly what she was paid to do and not one thing more, had been present in the silent anatomy of 3 separate near disasters before 4:15 in the afternoon. "You think you're making a point," Celeste said. "I think I'm doing my job," Naomi said. "Don't play games with me." "Miss Whitmore." Naomi kept her voice the same, level, professional, without warmth but also without malice. "I came to work this morning. I completed my assigned tasks. I followed every protocol in your memos. If there are performance concerns, I'd ask that they be raised through the formal HR process." She paused. "Is there anything else?" The silence that followed was approximately 10 seconds long. It felt longer. Naomi stood inside it without flinching. Celeste said, "You will regret this." Naomi said nothing. Celeste left. Naomi turned back to the linen closet. She picked up the pillowcases and continued counting. Her hands were not shaking. She made note of that, with the small private part of her that was keeping score on her own behalf. Her hands were not shaking. She was not going to shake. But the fear in Celeste's eyes stayed with her, not because it frightened her, because it told her something she needed to know. Celeste had not understood, until that moment, what she had actually cut. She had thought she was cutting hair. The rest of the day passed in a particular kind of charged quiet. Word had moved through the estate the way word always moved in closed communities, faster than any official communication, slower than the truth, and carrying approximately 60% of the actual facts surrounded by 40% of interpretation. By dinner time, most of the domestic staff knew that something significant had happened at lunch, and that Naomi was somehow at the center of it, though the specifics varied depending on who was telling it. What they all agreed on: Naomi had come to work. Naomi had looked fine. Naomi was doing her job. That last part was the one people kept returning to. Naomi is doing her job. Said in a tone that implied a great deal more than the literal meaning. Said in the tone people use when they're describing an act that appears simple and is actually seismic. By 8 o'clock, Gerald had found her. He was waiting outside the staff changing room when she finished her shift, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has been rehearsing a speech and is no longer sure he wants to give it. "You could have warned us," he said. "Before you—" He stopped. "Before things changed." She looked at him. "Warned you about what?" "Don't." His voice was tired, not angry, tired. "You know what you're doing." "Gerald." She shifted her bag on her shoulder. "For 4 years, people have assumed that the things I did were part of my job. They weren't. I was doing my actual job plus approximately 40% extra out of my own choice. I've made a different choice. That's not a warning situation. That's just a correction." He was quiet for a moment. "The estate is going to fall apart." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe people will figure out the actual gaps in the system and fix them properly. Either way." She met his eyes. "That's above my pay grade." She went home. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the equipment shed view room, and she took off her shoes and she sat there for a while doing nothing at all. The evening was quiet. The fog had come back in off the water. At 9:45, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered because she always answered numbers she didn't recognize, but a habit from years of being the person people called when nothing else was working. The voice on the other end was Trish, Celeste's assistant, speaking very quietly, like she was in a room where she didn't want to be overheard. "I'm sorry to call you," Trish said. "I got your number from the staff directory. A pause. "I wanted to say I'm sorry about last night. I was standing right there. I should have done something." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. "It's okay, Trish." "It's not. I know it's not." Another pause. "She's going to try to have you terminated. I heard her on the phone with Mr. DeLuca's office manager this afternoon. She's building a case. She's saying you're being insubordinate." Naomi opened her eyes. "She has documentation from today," Trish continued. "The memos, the acknowledgement responses. She's framing it as malicious compliance." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "How long do I have?" "Luciano comes back Sunday. She wants it done before he gets back." "Sunday. 3 days." Thank you, Naomi said, for telling me. I... Trish stopped. I know you didn't ask for this. I know it's not... I just thought you should know. You did the right thing. She hung up. She sat in the silence of her small room and she thought about Sunday. 3 days. She thought about a week-long negotiation in Chicago and a man who came back to a house he thought he understood and would find instead something hollowed out, something running on the memory of what it used to be. She thought about 30 inches of hair on a marble floor. She thought about what Trish had said. Malicious compliance. She almost laughed, not bitterly, just with a kind of grim recognition. That was what it looked like from the outside, she supposed. Malicious. As though the only reason a person would do precisely their job was to cause harm. As though the years of doing more than her job, invisibly, silently, without a single acknowledgement or additional dollar, were simply the baseline, the expected condition, the water that fish don't notice because it's the only element they've ever breathed. She picked up her phone again. She opened the Notes app. She began typing. Not a complaint, not a resignation, not an accusation, a record. 4 years' worth of things she had done that were never in her job description, dates where she could remember them, names, situations, the scheduling conflicts she'd caught, the dietary issues she'd flagged, the interpersonal crises she'd quietly diffused before they became public problems, the safety gaps she'd covered, the grief she'd absorbed, the emergencies she'd managed in the margins of a job she was never paid to do any of those things in. She typed for 2 hours and 20 minutes. When she finally stopped, she had approximately 40 pages of notes. She saved the document. She backed it up to a cloud drive she'd been paying $6 a month for since she was 28 years old and had learned, the expensive way, that things you don't document don't exist. Then she put the phone down and lay back on the narrow bed in the equipment shed view room, and she stared at the ceiling in the dark. She was not going to resign. She was not going to be provoked into something Celeste could use as justification. She was not going to make this easier for anyone. But she was also not going under. She was going to stand on the exact ground she'd always stood on, the ground of her own dignity, her own documented truth. And she was going to let Sunday come. 3 days. Luciano De Luca was coming home in 3 days, and the house he was returning to was already a different house. Naomi knew it the moment she woke up Thursday morning and heard the silence. Not the regular silence of early hours. The estate was never fully quiet. There was always something running, some mechanical hum, some distant footstep, some radio crackling in a security booth somewhere across the grounds. This was a different kind of silence. The silence of a place where the informal networks had stopped talking to each other, where people were waiting instead of moving. She dressed. She went to the staff kitchen. The coffee was wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic way. Just slightly off, the ratio slightly incorrect, the water temperature slightly low, the kind of thing that happened when nobody was quietly making sure it didn't happen. Naomi poured it anyway and drank it standing at the counter and did not fix it. That was the new discipline. Noticing without acting. It had seemed clean when she'd decided it, lying on her bed at midnight with her phone full of 4 years of invisible labor. In daylight, it felt different. It felt like watching a crack in a wall and choosing not to fill it. Correct? Necessary. And deeply, physically uncomfortable in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was 3 days into it and already she could feel the shape of what was coming. By 8 in the morning, 2 things had gone wrong in her assigned corridor alone. A linen cart had been staged incorrectly and was blocking a fire exit. A safety issue that someone in facilities should have caught during their morning walkthrough. She photographed it and sent a formal report to the facility's supervisor through the correct channel and continued to her first room. An hour later, the cart was still there because the facility's supervisor was waiting for Celeste's office to confirm the action, and Celeste's office didn't open until 9. She stepped around the cart and kept moving. The second thing was smaller but more telling. A guest, a man in his 60s named Harrington, who'd been staying in the estate's long-term executive suite for 3 weeks, while his company negotiated something Naomi didn't know the details of, stopped her in the corridor and asked if she could let the kitchen know he needed his lunch medication window shifted by 45 minutes due to a late morning call. Naomi had been the one managing Harrington's medication window informally for 3 weeks. He told her about it the second day when they'd passed each other in the corridor and he'd looked slightly gray and slightly worried and she'd asked if he was all right. She looked at him now, He had the kind of face that didn't show vulnerability easily. 60 years of business and money had built a specific architecture over whatever he'd started with. But right now there was something around his eyes that was genuinely uncertain. She said, "You'll want to contact the guest services desk directly, Mr. Harrington. They can communicate that to the kitchen." He frowned slightly. "You've been handling that." "I was helping out informally. The official channel is guest services. They're on extension 4. He looked at her for a moment. He was not a stupid man. She'd known that from the first week. And she watched him read the situation with the particular speed of someone accustomed to reading rooms for a living. "Something's changed," he said. It wasn't a question. "The guest services desk is on extension 4, she said again gently. "They'll take care of you." She went into her assigned room and closed the door and stood with her back against it for exactly 10 seconds. Then she started cleaning. The termination notice arrived at 11:47. She was in the third-floor storage room doing a supply inventory when Trish appeared in the doorway. Not striding, not urgent, moving with the careful, apologetic energy of someone delivering something they didn't want to deliver. She was holding a sealed envelope. Naomi looked at it. She looked at Trish. She set down her clipboard. "HR?" she asked. "The letter is from Miss Whitmore's office," Trish said, "but it has HR formatting. I think she had them prepare it." She paused. "I didn't know about this part specifically. I want you to know that." "I know." Naomi took the envelope. She didn't open it immediately. She turned it over in her hands once, feeling the weight of it. "Is there a timeline?" "End of day Friday. She wants you off the property before Mr. DeLuca comes back Sunday." "Of course she does." "What's the stated reason?" Trish swallowed. "Insubordination, failure to perform duties, and—" She stopped. "And?" "Creating a hostile work environment." The irony of that last one landed somewhere between Naomi's ribs and sat there, sharp-edged and airless. She breathed through it. "Okay," she said. "Naomi, you can contest it. There's a formal— I know the process." She set the envelope on the shelf beside her clipboard. "Thank you for telling me about this, Trish, for all of it. You didn't have to do any of that." Trish looked at her with an expression that was 2 parts guilt and 1 part something close to admiration. "I'm sorry. I'm really, genuinely sorry." "I know you are." Naomi picked up her clipboard. "Go back to work. Don't do anything that puts your own job at risk. You have enough to manage." Trish left. Naomi opened the envelope. The letter was 3 paragraphs. Formal language, HR boilerplate in the structure, but the specifics had been chosen carefully. It cited the Wednesday lunch incident, framed as willful withholding of critical safety information. It cited her responses to Celeste's memos, described as compliance designed to cause operational disruption rather than genuine professional conduct. It cited an unnamed witness account describing her behavior as intended to undermine management authority. She read it twice. Slowly. She wasn't looking for emotional reactions to it. She was looking for the legal structure, the evidentiary claims, the specific language that could be contested, and the language that was deliberately vague. The safety information claim was the dangerous one. If Celeste's office had framed the peanut incident as Naomi deliberately withholding information that caused harm to a person, that was not just an employment matter. That could be something else. She put the letter in her bag. She finished the inventory. She went to the HR office at 1:15. The HR director was a man named Warren, 53, who'd been at the estate for 8 years and who Naomi had helped exactly once, 2 years ago, when his teenage son had gotten into a situation that required a specific kind of quiet intervention, and he'd been at a loss, and Naomi had known the right person to call. He'd never mentioned it directly. He'd left a plant on her desk the following week without a note. He looked uncomfortable when she walked in. He didn't look surprised. "Naomi," he said. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down." She sat. She placed her hands on her knees. She looked at him directly. "Did you draft this?" she asked. He shifted. "The process was initiated through Miss Whitmore's office. I provided the—" "Warren," she kept her voice even. "Did you draft this letter?" A pause. "I formatted it. The substantive claims were provided by Miss Whitmore's office, including the safety incident framing." Another pause. Longer. "Naomi, I want to be straight with you. I advised against that specific language. The record doesn't support a claim of deliberate, then why is it in the letter? Because I was overruled. He said it quietly, with the specific shame of a man who knows he should have pushed harder and didn't. She has authority over my office while Mr. DeLuca is away. That's the reporting structure. Naomi looked at him. She let the silence sit for a moment. If I contest this, she said, and it goes to formal review, which it will, because I have documentation of 4 years of additional contributions that directly contradict the failure to perform claim, what happens to the safety incident framing? Warren picked up a pen and set it back down. It would need to be substantiated. The medical record of the incident, the dietary file status, witness accounts of what you knew and when. If the dietary file was genuinely incomplete through no fault of yours, then the framing doesn't hold. The dietary file was incomplete because it was never properly maintained, Naomi said. I had the information informally because I talked to people. That information should have been formally documented years ago. That's a systemic failure, not mine. I know that. Then put it in writing. He looked at her. What? Your internal assessment. Your professional opinion on the validity of the safety claim. In writing. Dated today. She held his gaze. You said you advised against that language. That's a record that exists. I'm asking you to make it formal. Warren was quiet for a long time. He turned the pen over in his fingers. He looked at his desk, then at the wall, then back at her. If I do that, he said slowly, and Celeste finds out. She'll find out eventually regardless, Naomi said. The question is whether the truth is documented when she does. He stared at her. She waited. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a sheet of official HR letterhead and uncapped the pen. She watched him write. It took 8 minutes. When he was done, he signed it and dated it and handed it to her. This is my professional assessment, he said. Nothing else. That's all I need. She folded it carefully and put it in her bag beside the termination letter. She stood. Thank you, Warren. I should have done more, he said. Same words Marcus had used, same tone. This house was full of people who should have done more and knew it, and the knowing sat on them visibly now, heavy as weather. She didn't tell him it was all right this time. She just nodded and left. The twist came at 3 in the afternoon, and it came from a direction she hadn't prepared for. She was crossing the main hall, one of the estate's formal interior corridors, high ceilings, the kind of space that made footsteps sound ceremonial, when she heard voices through the partly open door of the east sitting room. She wasn't trying to listen. She was walking past. But the voices were raised enough that stopping them from reaching her would have required active effort, and she caught the words before she'd processed that she was hearing them. The first voice was Celeste, tight, controlled, but only just. The second voice was Gerald. Can't let this go to a formal review, Gerald was saying. If she contests it and it goes to Luciano, it won't go to Luciano, Celeste said. She'll be off the property by Friday evening. The review process takes 6 weeks minimum. By then, he'll already know something happened. Naomi's not the kind of person who disappears quietly, Celeste. You know that. She's a maid. Gerald stopped. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter, more careful. She's the reason half this staff stayed when you restructured the reporting hierarchy. Do you understand that? 3 people were planning to resign on Wednesday. 3 experienced people, including Bernard. Naomi talked them down. A pause. She talked them down, Celeste said. Without you knowing, without anyone knowing, officially. That's what she does. That's been her function in this house for 4 years. And another stop. I should have told you this a week ago. I should have briefed you on it when you arrived. That's on me. Why didn't you? The pause that followed was several seconds long and carried a weight inside it that Naomi felt even through a door and across 20 feet of corridor. Because I didn't think you'd care, Gerald said. The silence after that was complete. Naomi had stopped moving. She was standing 6 feet from the sitting room door, not hiding, just still, the way you go still when something is happening that you need to hear the full shape of before you can decide what to do with it. She's building a file, Gerald said. That's what I'm hearing. She's been documenting her contributions for 2 days, 4 years of informal work, dates, names, specifics. If that file reaches Luciano, then we need to make sure it doesn't reach him. How? Gerald. Celeste's voice shifted. Something underneath it now that Naomi hadn't heard from her before. Something with actual edges. I need to know whose side you're on. A beat. I work for this estate, Gerald said. That's not what I asked. Another beat, longer. I'll talk to the security team about the document, Gerald said. It came out flat, defeated, like a man who'd arrived at a line, looked at it, and stepped across it anyway. Naomi breathed. She turned and walked back the way she'd come, slowly, quietly, the way she'd been moving through this house for 4 years, like someone who knew how to pass through a space without leaving a mark. She went straight to her room. She opened her phone. She went to the notes document, 40 pages, 2 hours and 20 minutes of her life typed out in the dark. She selected all. She copied it. She opened her personal email account and composed a new message, addressed to 3 separate email addresses: her personal backup account, her cousin Renata in Atlanta, who was a paralegal, and a 4th address she'd created 2 years ago and never used, attached to no name, hosted by a server she paid for annually with a prepaid card. She pasted the document into the email body. She attached the HR letter from Warren. She attached the photographs of the fire exit blockage from this morning. She sent it. Then she went to the cloud drive and verified all 4 backup copies were current. Then she sat back on the bed and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Gerald. She had not seen that coming. She wanted to be honest about that. She prided herself on reading people, on understanding the architecture of a room and the motivations inside it, and she had missed this one. She'd read Gerald as territorial and occasionally petty but fundamentally stable, a man whose primary loyalty was to the structure he operated within, which meant loyalty to Luciano's estate above any individual. She'd thought that made him safe. She'd been wrong about the specific mechanism. She'd understood his character, but she'd underestimated how easily that character could be leveraged by someone who offered him the right framing. Not money. Gerald wasn't motivated by money. By alignment. By the particular social anxiety of a man who needed to be on the correct side of power and was very sensitive to signals about where that side currently was. Celeste had read him better than she had. That was the bitter part. She stood up. She went to the small mirror above her dresser and looked at herself. The short hair. The uniform. The face she'd been wearing all week. Composed, correct, giving nothing away. She looked tired. She looked like someone who'd been fighting a battle they weren't supposed to acknowledge was happening. She told herself the strategy was to document and wait. Wait for Luciano. Let the truth exist on paper, and let Sunday arrive. But Sunday was 3 days away, and Celeste now had Gerald and was talking to the security team about her file, and the file was already sent, but that didn't help her if she wasn't here to give it context. Documents without the person to explain them were just paper, and she was going to be off this property by Friday evening, 2 days before Luciano came home. She pressed both palms flat on the dresser surface. She breathed through her nose. She needed to make a decision in the next 60 seconds. Not a theoretical decision, a real one, with immediate steps. She could go to Luciano's office manager directly and request an emergency communication to Chicago. But the office manager reported to Celeste during Luciano's absence. That route was closed. She could go to one of Luciano's captains, the men who handled the actual business, the one she saw moving through the estate on serious business, who she knew by name and face but had never once directly engaged. That was a door she had never opened and wasn't sure she should open, and also had no idea what was on the other side of. She could call the one number Luciano had given her directly, 18 months ago, after the 3 a.m. pasta and the single question and the 11 minutes of silence. He'd written it on a piece of the estate's note card paper and set it on the counter when he left the kitchen and said, "If there's ever a problem with the house." A real one. She'd kept the card. She hadn't used it. She thought about whether this qualified as a real problem with the house. A woman was about to be removed from the premises for doing her job correctly, under a termination that included a falsified safety allegation. A senior manager had just agreed to interfere with her personal documentation. The estate was running on the fumes of 4 years of informal infrastructure that nobody had ever formally acknowledged, and the man who owned all of it was 2 days away from walking back into a house he didn't recognize. She opened her phone. She went to her contacts. She had transferred the number from the note card 18 months ago, late at night, because she was the kind of person who transferred important information to digital backup. She'd labeled it simply, "Estate, Emergency." She stared at it. Her thumb hovered. The door to her room opened without a knock. She spun around. It was Marcus. He was in full security kit, radio, vest, the whole architecture of his professional self. But his face was wrong. He looked like a man who'd been given an order he didn't want to carry out, and was doing it anyway and hating himself with every step. Behind him were two men she recognized from the outer security rotation, younger, bigger, expressionless. Marcus said, "Naomi, I need you to come with me." She looked at him. She looked at the two men behind him. She looked back at him. "Why?" she said, very quietly. He couldn't hold her gaze. He looked at the wall to the left of her head. "Miss Whitmore has authorized a precautionary review of employee personal devices under the estates. She wants my phone," Naomi said. "Naomi, Marcus." She kept her voice low and direct. "Look at me." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were carrying something heavy. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Whatever is on my phone is already somewhere else. It went somewhere else 45 minutes ago, so this accomplishes nothing except telling me exactly how far this has gone." He didn't say anything. "And it's gone very far," she said. A beat of silence. "I have to do this," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "I'm sorry. I know." She looked at him for a moment. At this man who'd sat across from her at 6 in the morning and eaten scrambled eggs and told her he thought whatever she'd decided was a long time coming. "You're going to have to live with this one, Marcus. That's yours to carry." She held out her phone. He took it. He looked like someone receiving something he'd just lost the right to touch. One of the younger men stepped forward. "Miss Brooks, Miss Whitmore has also requested that you remain in your quarters pending a final HR meeting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. She looked at him. He had the careful, blank face of someone executing an instruction they hadn't thought about too hard. "Am I being detained?" she asked. A pause. "It's a precautionary—" "Am I being detained?" she said again. Same tone, same register. He glanced at Marcus. Marcus said nothing. "No," the younger man said. "Then I'll be at the meeting tomorrow morning," she said. "Good night." She looked at Marcus one more time. He was still holding her phone. He was still looking at the wall. She closed the door. She sat on the bed in the dim room. No phone, no clock, except the one on the wall above the desk. The equipment shed outside the window going dark. And she thought very carefully about what she still had and what she didn't. She didn't have her phone. She had the termination letter and Warren's assessment in her bag. The emails had gone before Marcus arrived. The cloud drive was on a server she accessed through a login that Celeste's team, unless they were considerably more sophisticated than she had reason to believe, could not reach without credentials she had memorized and never written down. She had 40 pages of 4 years. She had until 8 a.m. tomorrow. She had the number she'd memorized off the note card. She'd memorized it the night she transferred it to her phone, because she was the kind of woman who memorized important things, who understood at some fundamental level that the things you cannot lose are the things you carry inside you. She didn't have a phone. She did have a landline in the staff corridor. Room 14, the old housekeeping supply office. The phone in there was on a separate internal line, estate infrastructure, and she had been responsible for this corridor long enough to know that Celeste's communication audit had covered the internal digital systems, but had not, as far as she knew, covered the legacy landline infrastructure in the lower staff corridors, because nobody used landlines anymore. Nobody except Naomi, who had once spent a full hour on that landline, talking a young kitchen porter through a panic attack because his cell battery was dead, and she was the only person still in the building. She knew where the spare key to that supply office was. She stood up. She crossed to the mirror and looked at herself one more time. Short hair, tired eyes. A woman who had spent 4 years making herself indispensable to protect herself from being disposable, and had just discovered that the protection was an illusion, that you could give everything and still end up in a room with no phone and an 8 a.m. deadline and a senior manager who'd chosen the wrong side for the oldest reason in the world. She looked at herself for a long time. Then something shifted in her face. Not dramatically. She wasn't the kind of person who had dramatic shifts in mirrors. Something quieter than that. Something that had been waiting underneath the composure and the strategy and the careful professional stillness of the past week finally came to the surface and settled there. She was done waiting. She was done carrying this in the careful, invisible, documented way she'd been trying to manage it. She was done trusting that the truth would arrange itself correctly if she just held it properly and survived until Sunday. Sunday was not guaranteed. And the truth, she had learned at a significant cost over the past 72 hours, does not arrange itself. It gets arranged by whoever is willing to do the arranging. And so far, she had been doing her arranging very quietly in a room by herself, while Celeste was doing hers in every corridor of a house Naomi knew better than she did. She turned away from the mirror. She went to the door. She opened it. The corridor was empty. Marcus and his people had gone, their job done, the estate settling back into its strange, charged quiet. She walked to room 14. She retrieved the key from the third hook of the maintenance panel, behind the circuit box where she had put it 2 years ago after the panic attack and the dead battery, because she'd decided then that she never wanted to be in a situation where she needed that room and couldn't get in. She unlocked the door. She went to the desk. She sat down. She picked up the handset. She dialed the number she'd memorized off a piece of note card paper on a night. 18 months ago, when a man had asked her if she was all right, and she'd said yes because she always said yes. It rang 3 times. Then a voice, low, slightly rough, the voice of a man who'd been in a meeting or a car or both, said, "Yeah." One word, that was all. But she knew the voice. She said, "It's Naomi Brooks. You told me to call if there was a real problem with the house." A pause. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. She heard something shift on his end. A door, maybe, or a chair. Background noise dropping away. "Talk," he said. She talked. She didn't rush it. She didn't perform distress. There was enough real distress available that performing it would have been redundant, and she wasn't that kind of person anyway. She laid it out in sequence, the way she'd been organizing it in her head since Monday. The banquet, the scissors, the memos, the lunch incident, the termination letter, Warren, Gerald, Marcus, and the phone. She talked for 11 minutes without interruption. When she finished, the line was quiet for long enough that she checked the handset to make sure the call was still connected. Then Luciano said, "Are you in a safe location right now?" "My own corridor, staff wing." "Stay there tonight. Don't go to the 8 a.m. meeting." "If I don't go, I said don't go." His voice wasn't loud. It was something beyond loud. It had the particular density of a voice that doesn't need volume because it has never in its life needed to repeat itself. "I'll be there by 6 in the morning." She felt something release in her chest, something she hadn't realized she'd been clenching. "Luciano." She said his name directly for the first time in 4 years. She'd always called him Mr. DeLuca in the formal register of the professional relationship, the correct distance. "The documentation I told you about, it's been sent to external accounts. If anything happens to, nothing is going to happen to you." A pause. Then, quieter. "Nothing else." She understood that nothing else to be doing significant work in that sentence. She understood it to mean he'd already calculated what had happened and where it sat on a scale that mattered to him. 6 a.m., she said. 6 a.m. She set the handset back in the cradle. She sat in the dim supply office for a moment, her hands flat on the desk, and let herself feel the aftermath of the phone call, the adrenaline that had been fueling her for the past 4 hours cycling down through her system, leaving something shakier and more honest in its wake. She was exhausted. Not the surface exhaustion of a long day. The deep kind. The kind that lives in the structure of a person, in the load-bearing parts. She thought about the linen cart blocking the fire exit this morning. She thought about Marguerite's EpiPen. She thought about Philip standing in the corridor with his clipboard, his face doing the math on what her withdrawal meant. She thought about 30 inches of hair on a marble floor. She turned off the light. She locked the room behind her. She went back to her quarters and she lay down on the narrow bed, still in her uniform, and she closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep. She slept. He arrived at 5:47. She knew because she was already awake, had been awake since 5, lying in the gray pre-dawn, listening to the estate breathe its wrong breathing, the off-rhythm of a place that didn't know something was about to happen to it. She was dressed. Bag packed with the termination letter, Warren's assessment, and a change of clothes she'd added at midnight purely out of the practical acknowledgement that she didn't know what today was going to look like. She heard the motorcade before she saw it. 4 vehicles, the particular sound of serious security running fast on private road. They came through the gate at 5:44, and she was standing at her window watching the headlights sweep across the grounds, and then she went and sat on her bed and waited. She heard him in the house at 5:51. Not his voice. Not yet. The sound of a man moving through a space he owns, the specific quality of footsteps that don't ask permission from the floors they cross. She heard other voices. The security team, the estate's overnight duty manager, at least two other people she couldn't identify. She heard a door open and close in the main hall. She heard something that might have been an order given in a low, compressed voice. Then silence. Then, at 6:03, a knock on her door. Not security. The knock was single, clean, with a particular quality she recognized. The knock of someone who is in a hurry but is still choosing to knock instead of opening. She opened the door. Luciano De Luca stood in the corridor of the staff residential wing with his coat still on and the look of a man who had driven or flown through the night and hadn't stopped moving since. He was 41. She sometimes forgot that in the day-to-day texture of the estate, forgot that the composed, meticulous architecture of him was sitting on top of something considerably more volatile. She didn't forget it now. It was right there in his face, in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. The particular stillness that in other men would be calm, but in Luciano was the opposite of calm. He looked at her hair. He looked at it for 2 seconds, and she watched something move through his face. A brief, controlled passage of something that had actual heat behind it. And then he looked at her eyes. "Are you all right?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like he was calibrating. "I'm functional," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "I've had better weeks." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. The situation was 17 miles from a smile. But it was something. A recognition. He said, "I need the full version, not the phone call version. Everything." "Right now?" "Right now." She told him. Everything she'd told him on the phone, plus the parts she'd compressed. The texture of the past week. The accumulation of small things that had added up to the pattern. The Wednesday dinner and the way Celeste had watched her. The specific look on Celeste's face after the seating catch. The anatomy of a jealousy that had made no sense from the outside because the thing it was threatened by had never been a threat. She talked for 20 minutes. He stood in the doorway of her small room. Didn't come in, didn't sit down, just stood with his arms crossed and his full attention on her. And he listened the way he listened, which was completely. She'd noticed it years ago, the quality of his listening. Most powerful men listened while simultaneously composing their response. Luciano actually listened. It was one of 2 or 3 things about him that she'd filed separately from everything else. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Gerald piece," he said. "You heard this directly." "Through a door, not hidden. I was walking past and the door was open and the voices were raised enough that I caught it before I'd processed that I was hearing it." "What exactly did he say about the security team?" "He said he'd talked to them about the document. The 40 pages. Luciano nodded once, a single nod that seemed to be confirming something internal rather than responding to her. "The document is safe," he said. 4 separate locations. None of them on this property." He almost smiled again. "Good." He pushed off the doorframe. "Stay here until I come back for you. Don't answer the door for anyone else." "Luciano." She said his name again, and he paused. "What are you going to do?" He looked at her. His eyes were very dark and very clear. "Find out how bad it is," he said. He left. The sound of the estate changing was something she felt before she heard it. It started at 6:20, a shift in the ambient noise of the building, doors opening on floors above her, voices in the main corridors that had a different register than the usual morning. By 6:45, it had become something more defined. The particular sound of an organization receiving information it hadn't expected, processing it in real time, adjusting. At 7:08, she heard Celeste's voice. Not the words. She was too far away and 1 floor up, but the register. High and controlled and very fast, the voice of a woman who had arrived downstairs expecting a Friday morning and found something else entirely. Naomi sat on her bed. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she breathed and she did not go to the door. At 7:22, Marcus knocked. She recognized the knock this time. She recognized his knock specifically, the weight behind it. She opened the door. He looked terrible. He looked like a man who had been awake all night making peace with something and hadn't finished making peace with it when the morning arrived and rendered the whole exercise moot. He was holding her phone. He held it out without speaking. She took it. She looked at it. She looked at him. "He called you in," she said. "Yeah." His voice was rough. "How bad was it?" Marcus looked at the floor. "He asked me directly what happened Wednesday night, what I saw, what I did, and what I did last night." She waited. "I told him the truth," Marcus said. "All of it." She nodded. "He's not... I'm still..." He said... Marcus stopped, ran a hand over his face. "He said my job was to protect people on this property, and I'd done the opposite of that, and I needed to figure out whether I was capable of understanding the difference." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd sat across from her in the kitchen, who'd carried her coffee for a year without being asked, who'd stood in her doorway with two other men and taken her phone because someone with authority told him to. "Are you?" she said. "Am I what?" "Capable of understanding the difference." He met her eyes. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." "Then that's what matters." She put the phone in her bag. "Go do your job, Marcus." He stood there another second. Then he nodded, once, and he went. At 8:15, Luciano came back. He knocked twice, then opened the door. She'd left it unlocked. And he came in and closed it behind him. He didn't have his coat on anymore. His sleeves were rolled up. He looked like a man who had covered significant ground in the past 2 hours and wasn't done yet. He said, "I need you to come to the main hall." She stood. "What's happening?" "I've called a staff assembly. Everyone on the property, full domestic, security, operations, the kitchen. Anyone not on an essential post." She looked at him. "That's every person," he said. "I've been in this house 12 years, and I've never held one. I think it's past time." She picked up her bag. He looked at it. "You won't need that," he said. "I'd like to bring it anyway." He didn't argue. They walked out together. Through the staff corridor, through the interior passage that connected the residential wing to the main house, up through the East Service stair into the formal hall. She'd walked these passages thousands of times. She knew every step, every sound, where the third stair creaked and where the door at the top stuck in humid weather and needed to be lifted slightly. She noticed, as they walked, that Luciano was matching her pace. Not leading, not directing her. Walking beside her. She wasn't sure he was aware of it. She didn't say anything. The main hall was full. Not in the formal, arranged way of a banquet or an event. Full in the raw, gathered way of people who'd been told to come immediately, and had come, in whatever they'd been wearing, some with equipment still in hand, some looking like they'd just been woken up, all of them filling the space with the particular collective energy of a group that knows something significant is happening, but doesn't know what. Naomi counted, by habit, as she entered. 93 people. Roughly the full domestic and operations complement, minus whoever was running essential posts outside. They saw Luciano first. That was always how it worked. He was the gravitational center of any room he was in, had been for as long as she'd known him, and the assembly rippled and settled as he came through the door, with Naomi 2 steps behind him. Then they saw her, and the ripple changed in quality. She felt it, the shift in the room as they registered her presence beside him, together, here, now, this morning. She saw Danielle near the middle of the crowd, put a hand to her mouth. She saw Philip go very still. She saw Bernard, flour still on his forearm from early kitchen prep, exhale slowly. She saw Gerald. He was near the back. He had the look of a man standing in a room where the temperature has changed and he doesn't know which direction to move. She didn't look for Celeste immediately. She waited until she'd settled into her own position, to the right of the assembly, slightly apart, the way she always stood when she was in a room like this. Attendant, observing. Then she found her. Celeste was standing near the front to the left of the speaker's position. She was perfectly put together. She was always perfectly put together. Naomi was beginning to understand this was a form of armor for her, that the assembly of perfect surfaces was what she did when she was afraid. She had the precise, controlled expression of a woman who has decided what this is and is waiting to demonstrate that she's decided correctly. She was watching Luciano. She had not yet looked at Naomi. Luciano stood at the center of the hall. He didn't need a microphone. The hall's acoustics were good and his voice carried the way voices do when people are already listening, He said, I came back early. He let that sit for a moment. I came back because I got a phone call Thursday night that I should have gotten sooner. And the reason I should have gotten it sooner is something I've been thinking about since the drive here, which took about 3 hours. And I've been thinking about it wrong until about 40 minutes ago. The room was very quiet. I've been thinking about why someone who had a legitimate problem in my house didn't come to me with it immediately. And I was framing it as a question about process, about the reporting structure, about whether the right channels were clear. That's the wrong frame, he paused. The right frame is simpler. She didn't come to me because it shouldn't have gotten to a point where she needed to. And it got there because I wasn't paying attention to things I should have been paying attention to. Naomi stood very still. I want to ask something, he said. And I want honest answers, not careful ones. I want to know. He stopped. He looked out at the assembly, and she watched him locate Naomi briefly, a quick look before he looked back at the room. I want to know who in this room has been helped by Naomi Brooks. Not helped as part of her job. Helped. In the way you help someone when you don't have to, and you do it anyway. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the elderly housekeeper, a woman named Petra, who'd been at the estate for 15 years, and who Naomi had helped through a lease dispute 3 years ago, raised her hand. And then Bernard raised his. And then the chauffeur, Thomas, who Naomi had once driven to the hospital at 2 in the morning when his wife went into early labor because his hands were shaking too hard to drive, raised his. And then Danielle and Philip, and 2 of the kitchen staff, and the woman from accounting who handled staff payroll, who Naomi had helped navigate an insurance appeal that had taken 4 months and a lot of phone calls on her lunch breaks. And then more. They didn't just raise hands, they started talking, not waiting to be called on, just talking, in the way people talk when a pressure has been building long enough and a valve finally opens. Overlapping voices, specific stories, dates and situations and things Naomi had done that she'd genuinely forgotten about because she'd never expected to be asked to account for them. The scheduling conflicts, the grief support, the careers quietly protected, the emergencies managed, the times someone had needed something and there was no official channel fast enough, and Naomi had simply been there. She stood at the right side of the hall, and she listened to 4 years of her own invisible life being made visible, and she held herself very carefully together. Her jaw was tight. She was not going to cry in this room. She was not. She looked at Danielle. Danielle was already crying, making no effort to stop, and when she caught Naomi's eyes, she shook her head slightly, as if to say, "Let it be. Let it be what it is." Naomi looked back at the assembly. She looked at the hands. 93 people. She counted the hands. 78. She looked at the 15 who hadn't raised theirs. New staff, mostly. People she hadn't yet had time to help. 1 or 2 she'd had friction with. Reasonable. She didn't expect unanimity. She'd never expected unanimity. And then she looked at who was still seated. Gerald, hands in his lap, looking at the floor. And Celeste. Celeste, who had remained in her position at the front of the room, seated on the edge of the low bench near the speaking area, with her back straight and her hands folded and the perfect intact surface of her expression. And below that, something entirely different. Something happening behind her eyes that Naomi could see from across the room, even through everything else that was happening, because she'd been reading Celeste Whitmore's face for 6 months, and she knew its geography. It wasn't rage. She'd expected rage. It was the look of a person watching a story end differently than they wrote it. The look of someone who had constructed a narrative. I am the threat. She is the threat. Power is the mechanism. Elimination is the solution. And was sitting in the ruins of that narrative while 78 people raised their hands. Luciano let the room speak for 7 minutes. He didn't interrupt, didn't direct, didn't manage it. He stood and he listened the way he listened, completely. And Naomi watched him absorb 7 minutes of evidence about what had been happening in his house for 4 years and what had happened to it in the past week. When the room quieted naturally, he spoke. I failed to see something important, he said. That's on me. It is completely on me, and I'm not going to stand here and explain it away. He looked at Naomi directly. Not briefly this time, fully, the whole room watching him do it. You were the foundation of this house. I should have known that. I should have made sure you knew that I knew it. She held his gaze. She didn't look away. She let the words land. Then he turned. He turned and he looked at Celeste, and the quality of the room shifted again. The way a room shifts when the thing everyone has been waiting for finally arrives. Celeste stood. She'd been sitting, and now she stood. The reflex of a person who has spent their whole life managing rooms by managing their own physical presence within them. And she stood and she met his eyes and she said, before he could speak, "Luciano, I made a decision about staff management that I believed was necessary for—" "Stop," he said. She stopped. The word hadn't been loud. It had been the opposite of loud, but it occupied the entire hall. He walked toward her. Not fast, steady. The walk of someone who has already arrived at the conclusion and is now simply completing the physical distance. He stopped 4 feet from her. "She has been cutting her hair since she was 19 years old," he said, "because her grandmother used to braid it. That's what you took." Celeste's jaw tightened. "It was—" "Don't," he said. "I've heard what it was." A beat. "It was a mistake," he said. "Not the kind you apologize for and move past. The kind that tells me something I needed to know." She looked at him. The controlled surface was fracturing now. Not in a dramatic way, in the granular way of things that have been held too tightly for too long. "I was protecting what we—" "You were afraid," he said, "of a woman who was doing her job. And instead of asking yourself what that fear was actually about, you picked up a pair of scissors." He paused. "And then you tried to have her fired for the crime of only doing her job." She was doing exactly what she was contracted to do, and not one thing more. And the reason that caused this much damage is because she'd been doing twice that for 4 years, and nobody, including me, ever formally recognized it. His voice hadn't risen. It had, if anything, gotten quieter with each sentence, the particular compression of a man who keeps his anger very close to the floor. "This is not about you and Naomi. This was never about Naomi. This was about you and a fear you didn't know how to manage. And you made choices that affected 70-something people in my house, and one woman in particular in a way that I will not—" He stopped himself. One breath. "It was only hair," Celeste said, quietly, like a last line of defense being offered because there's nothing else left. The room was so still Naomi could hear the October wind against the east windows. Luciano said, "No." Just that. No. It was dignity. He reached up. He removed the ring from his left hand. Not the engagement ring, that was hers, she wore hers, but the band he'd been wearing for 8 months, the one that had appeared on his hand quietly and without announcement in the way things in Luciano's life tended to be official before they were announced. He set it on the bench beside where she'd been sitting. He said, "I need you to leave the estate, today. Everything you need will be arranged." Celeste looked at the ring on the bench. She looked at him. Something moved across her face that Naomi chose not to read in detail because it wasn't hers to read. It was a private collapse, whatever it was, and she looked away from it. Nobody in the room made a sound. Then Celeste straightened. The surface came back. Not the full architecture of it. There wasn't enough left for the full architecture, but enough. She was, whatever else was true of her, a woman who had been trained from birth to walk out of rooms correctly. She picked up nothing. She looked at no one else in the room. She walked to the main doors. She opened them. She left. The doors swung closed behind her, and for approximately 5 seconds, 93 people breathed the same air in absolute silence. Then Luciano turned back to the room. To Naomi specifically, though the words carried to everyone. "I'm going to need about an hour," he said. "Then I'd like to sit down with you. There are some things I want to change about how this house runs, and I want your input before I decide anything." She looked at him. The bag was still on her shoulder. The termination letter was still in it, and Warren's assessment, and 4 years of documentation she'd typed out in the dark. She said, "I'll be in the staff kitchen." He almost smiled. "Of course you will." She turned to leave. Danielle was in her path. The older woman looked at her with those cry-wrecked eyes and said nothing at all, just opened her arms. And Naomi, who had spent a week being made of composure, who had held herself together through scissors and silence and termination letters and a phone call she'd made from a landline in a supply closet, walked into that hug and held on. She held on for a long moment. Then she straightened. She pressed her hand briefly to Danielle's cheek. She walked through the crowd, through the people who reached out to touch her arm, who said her name, who looked at her with the specific expression of people who understand, too late, but genuinely, what they've been given and nearly let be taken. She walked through all of it, steady, present, upright. She went to the staff kitchen. She started coffee. The good ratio this time, the right temperature. Because some things you withdraw and some things you simply cannot stop being. She was standing at the counter when the door opened and Philip came in, looking like a man who'd just survived something and hadn't processed it yet. He stood in the doorway. What happens now? She poured the first cup, set it in front of him. Now, she said, we figure out what the house actually needs, instead of assuming it'll figure itself out. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He stared into it. Should I be worried? He said. About my job. With everything that… Philip. She looked at him. You documented everything. You followed the channels. You did your job correctly under an impossible structure. She paused. The people who need to be worried are the people who made choices they have to explain. You're not one of them. He exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind that carries actual weight. The coffee finished. The kitchen filled with the smell of it, ordinary, domestic, the smell of a morning continuing past the point where it had almost stopped. Outside, in the main hall, she could hear Luciano's voice beginning the harder conversations, the ones that would take longer than an hour, the ones about structure and accountability, and what it actually cost a house to run on one person's invisible labor for 4 years. She heard Gerald's voice briefly, defensive at first, then quieter. She heard Warren. She didn't hear Marcus, but she didn't need to. She knew where Marcus was. He was at his post, doing his job, which was the only answer any of them had to the question of how you carry the things you'd done. She poured her own coffee. She stood at the counter the way she'd stood there 1,000 mornings before, in the specific quiet of a kitchen before the full day begins, and she held the cup in both hands, and she let herself feel the weight of the past week, the full weight, not the managed, compressed, strategic version she'd been carrying through the days, but the real thing, all of it, the scissors, the marble floor, the supply closet at 9:45 at night with a dead phone and a number she'd memorized off a note card. 78 hands, she breathed. The kitchen door opened and Bernard came in. He was still wearing his apron. He stopped when he saw her, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for a week, with the particular guilt of a man who'd stayed seated too long. And she looked back at him and she said, I need a favor. He blinked. Anything. Can you show me how to make your soufflé, the one that collapsed at the important event? He stared at her. I've been meaning to learn for 2 years, she said. I keep running out of time. Bernard looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to the refrigerator and began pulling out ingredients, and his shoulders came down about 2 inches from where they'd been, and he said gruffly, You'll need to be patient. It's not forgiving. I know, she said. Show me anyway. Outside, the morning continued. October light came through the kitchen windows and lay itself across the countertops in long, flat planes, the way it does that specific time of year when the angle changes and the light gets honest about how far it's traveled. And in the main hall, Luciano De Luca was having a different conversation than the one anyone had prepared for. A harder one, a slower one, the kind that doesn't have a clean conclusion but has to happen anyway. The kind that begins with someone admitting what they failed to protect and ends, if they're honest enough, with something that the soufflé fell. Not catastrophically. Not the way Bernard described his legendary failure, the one that had become a state mythology over 12 years of retelling. This one simply sank in the center, a slow, dignified collapse, the edges holding their shape while the middle gave up and descended about 1.5 inches into the ramekin. Bernard looked at it. Naomi looked at it. You opened the oven too early, he said. I didn't touch the oven. You looked at it wrong. Soufflés no. She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter than a laugh, but warmer than a breath. And Bernard glanced at her sideways with the expression of a man who has been carrying guilt for a week and is cautiously relieved to find the person he wronged capable of something resembling amusement. We try again, he said. He was already reaching for the eggs. Bernard, she put her hand briefly on his forearm. Not to stop him, just to make him pause. He paused. It's okay. The first one is always for learning. He looked at the collapsed soufflé. He looked at her hand on his arm. He was 62 years old, Bernard, and he had the face of a man who had spent 4 decades in professional kitchens. Everything weathered and nothing wasted. I should have said something, he said. Wednesday night, when it happened. I was standing 6 feet away and You were calculating, she said. Same as everyone else. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed. It's not. But it's what happened, and it's done. She took her hand back. You can make it right going forward. That's all any of us get. He was quiet for a moment. Then he cracked 2 more eggs with the particular precision of someone whose hands have done this 10,000 times, and he said without looking up, the position he's going to offer you. She waited. Take it, Bernard said. I know you'll want to think about it too hard. Don't. Just take it. She looked at the fallen soufflé and the ramekin, its imperfect surface, the way it had tried. She didn't answer him, but she didn't say no. Luciano found her at 10:40. The kitchen had emptied by then. Bernard had gone back to lunch prep. Philip had come and gone twice. Danielle had stopped in for coffee and stayed for 40 minutes, and they talked about nothing important in the specific way that talking about nothing important is sometimes the most important thing. The morning had moved through its phases around her while she stood in the kitchen that was her anchor point in this house. And slowly, gradually, the quality of the day had shifted from crisis to aftermath. Aftermath had its own texture. She was learning it in real time. Luciano came in and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made, the good ratio, the right temperature, and he leaned against the counter opposite her and drank it without speaking for a moment. He'd shed some of the morning's urgency. Not all of it. He still had the look of a man who had covered a lot of ground and wasn't quite ready to stop moving, but the acute edge had softened into something more sustainable. He looked at the ramekin on the counter. Did you make that? Bernard was teaching me. It fell. He looked at the sunken center. Looks like it tried hard. First ones usually do. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The kitchen held them both in its ordinary way, and she was aware, in some peripheral part of her attention, that this was the second time they'd stood in a kitchen together at an odd hour with coffee and the specific equality of people who've run out of performance. He said, How long have you been doing this? Making soufflés? About 45 minutes. You know what I mean. She did. She set down her cup. She thought about how to answer honestly without it becoming something larger than the question. Since the beginning, she said, I noticed things. I fixed them. It became a habit, and then it became a system, and then it became, she paused. It became what the house ran on. I didn't plan that. It just accumulated. Why didn't you ever say anything? To me, specifically. She looked at him directly. Would you have believed me if I had? He held her gaze. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer, and she appreciated him for not giving her the easy version. I'd like to think yes, he said finally. But I don't know. Probably I would have heard it and then not changed anything because nothing was visibly broken. Things that run on invisible labor never look broken, she said, until the labor stops. Until someone takes scissors to the person doing it. The word scissors landed between them. She didn't flinch from it, neither did he. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer the actual question, not the careful version. All right. Are you staying because you want to be here, or because leaving feels like letting her win? The question was more precise than she'd expected. She stood with it for a moment, turning it over. Both, she said. At the start of this week, mostly the second. Right now, she looked around the kitchen, at the counter where she'd eaten bread at 3 a.m. 18 months ago, at the hooks where the staff left their aprons, at the light coming through the east window in its honest October way. Right now, I think mostly the first. That's an honest answer. You asked for one. He set his coffee cup down. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. He set it on the counter between them. Director of Household Operations and Staff Welfare, he said. I had Warren draft the position description this morning. Full salary review, formal authority, a seat at the operations table. Every decision that affects the domestic staff runs through you. She looked at the paper. She didn't pick it up. The title is a mouthful, she said. We can change the title. The job is what I've been doing for 4 years without the authority or the pay. Yes, he said, which is the entire point of making it formal. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Bernard had said. She thought about the 40 pages she'd typed in the dark, all of that invisible labor finally documented, finally on record. and what it meant to have it formally recognized versus what it meant to simply keep doing it, the way she'd always done it, from the habit of care. There are conditions, she said. He raised an eyebrow. The staff council, real authority, not advisory. Decisions affecting compensation and working conditions can't be overruled without documentation of cause. She picked up the paper now, unfolded it, read the first paragraph. And the dietary records, the scheduling overlaps, every informal system I built over 4 years, those get formally documented and officially maintained, not by me alone, by a team with actual resources. Done, he said. What else? The termination letter gets formally withdrawn and removed from my record. Warren's assessment gets added to the file instead. Already handled, this morning. She looked at him. You moved fast. I had 3 hours in a car to think about what I was going to walk into. He paused. I moved fast because the situation warranted it, and because he stopped. He looked at the counter for a moment, and she watched him navigate the specific discomfort of a man who is not accustomed to saying the version of a thing that makes him look like he missed something important. Because I should have been paying attention to what was happening in my own house. And I wasn't. And someone I should have been protecting paid for that. The kitchen was quiet. Luciano. She said his name with the same directness she'd been using since yesterday, since the phone call in the supply closet, since something between them had recalibrated into a different register. I'm not going to tell you it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I'm also not going to hold you responsible for a choice Celeste made. You didn't pick up those scissors. I created conditions where she thought she could. Maybe, she said, but you also came back at 6 in the morning. You also stood in that hall and said the true thing. People don't always do that. She looked at the position paper in her hands. Some of them never do. He was watching her. The specific quality of his attention. The full room listening, aimed entirely at her in a kitchen that was just a kitchen on a Friday morning in October. She folded the paper. She put it in her pocket. I'm not saying yes yet, she said. I need a week. An actual week, not a working week. Take 2. 1 is enough. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. And I want to renegotiate the terms with you directly, not through HR. That's not standard procedure. I know. A beat. Then he almost smiled. The full version this time, brief but real. 1 week. Renegotiate directly. Agreed. He took his coffee cup to the sink. He rinsed it. She noticed this, the small domestic act. A man who ran an empire rinsing his own coffee cup in a staff kitchen because he was standing next to a sink and it needed to be done. She filed it in the same place she'd filed the pasta at 3 in the morning, the single question, the 11 minutes of silence. He turned to go. He stopped at the door. Naomi. He said her name the way she'd been saying his, differently than before, with the small adjustment that happens when a relationship clarifies itself. The house feels like itself again this morning. I don't think it's because I came back. She looked at him. She let that land where it needed to land. The house feels like itself, she said carefully, because the people in it know someone is paying attention. That can't just be me. That's the part that has to change. He nodded, once. The nod that confirmed something internal. He left. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. Then she took the ramekin with the collapsed soufflé and she ate it standing at the counter because it had actually come out fairly well beneath the sunken center, and because wasting food had always seemed to her like a specific category of unnecessary loss. Gerald came to her at noon. She was in the corridor outside the 3rd-floor linen room. Her corridor, her regular rotation, the route she'd walked so many hundreds of times that her body knew the specific give of each floorboard. She'd gone back to work after the kitchen. Not because she had to, because she needed to, in the specific way of people who think better when their hands are occupied. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps. Gerald had a particular walk, slightly heavy on the right foot from an old knee injury, a sound she'd identified probably 3 years ago without ever consciously cataloging it. She knew it was him before he came around the corner. He stopped 10 feet from her. He was a big man, Gerald, broad, gray at the temples. The face of someone who had spent 20 years being competent and considered it a moral position. Right now he looked diminished, not physically, but in the way that people who have built their sense of themselves around being the right kind of person look when they've demonstrated, recently and specifically, that they aren't. He said, I don't expect you to forgive me. She stopped what she was doing. She turned to face him. I'm not going to, she said. Not cruelly, just clearly. He absorbed that. His jaw moved slightly. What I did, he stopped. I told myself it was about the estate, about managing the situation without making it worse. I told myself I was being pragmatic. I know what you told yourself, she said. People always have a version of themselves that sounds reasonable in their own head. I was wrong. Yes. I was afraid of her, he said. Celeste, I was afraid of what happened to people who ended up on the wrong side of her. I'd seen it in the week she ran things, and He stopped again. That's the reason. It's not an excuse. No, she agreed. It's not. He looked at her for a long moment. He had his hands at his sides, and she noticed he didn't know what to do with them. They kept making small adjustments, minor repositionings, the physical manifestation of a man who is more uncomfortable than he knows how to be. What happens now? He said. To me. She picked up her clipboard. She looked at it. I don't make that call, Gerald. Luciano does. Warren does. I'm a level 3 housekeeping associate until I decide otherwise. He flinched slightly at that. What I can tell you, she said, is that the way back from a thing like this isn't through the person you wronged. It's through the work, through every decision you make going forward where you choose differently. She looked at him. You're good at your job. You've been good at it for 12 years. That's not gone. But you have to decide what you're using that competence for. He stared at her. That's all I've got for you, she said. I've got a linen rotation to finish. She went back to work. She heard him stand there for another moment. Then she heard the right heavy footstep moving away down the corridor, slower than it usually moved, carrying something he was going to have to figure out how to set down on his own. Trish left on a Saturday. She came to find Naomi before she went, late afternoon, the estate going soft in the failing October light, everything golden and slightly melancholy. The way October things get when you let yourself look at them. She had a single bag over her shoulder and the look of a woman who has resigned and is not entirely sure she made the right decision, but is certain she made a necessary one. I couldn't stay, she said. I couldn't stay here and be the person who stood next to her for 6 months and did what I did. Naomi looked at her. She'd thought about Trish. She'd thought about the specific position of people like Trish, the assistants, the adjacents, the people who exist close to power and absorb its character by proximity and gradually stop noticing the thing they've become. Where are you going? She asked. My sister's, in Vermont. I'm going to figure out the next part. A pause. I called you. When she was building the case. I want you to know I almost didn't. I almost convinced myself it wasn't my business. But you did, Naomi said. Barely. Barely counts. She meant it. Barely is still the call. Barely is still choosing. Trish looked at her with something that was partly gratitude and partly the specific pain of a person who needed to hear that and isn't sure they deserve to. You're a better person than I would be, Trish said. In your position. I don't know that, Naomi said. I know I'm the person I've had to be. That's different. Trish nodded. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. She turned to go, then turned back. She stopped. Celeste. She wasn't always like that. I worked for her for 2 years before this posting. She was demanding and she was difficult, but she wasn't. Another stop. I don't know when it changed. I don't know what made the difference here specifically. I've been trying to figure that out. Naomi thought about it. She thought about the face she'd been reading for 6 months, the architecture of it, the fear underneath the precision. I think she knew, she said slowly, from the beginning, that this place ran on something she didn't have. And she couldn't figure out how to get it, so she decided to destroy it instead. She paused. That's not an explanation. It's just what I think happened. Trish was quiet for a moment. Do you feel sorry for her? The question sat in the October air between them. Parts of her, Naomi said finally. I feel sorry for the part that was that afraid. Because being that afraid of one maid means you must have been living in terror every single day. She paused. The part that picked up the scissors, though, no. I don't feel sorry for that part. Trish nodded slowly. She reached out and touched Naomi's arm briefly, a gesture that lasted about 2 seconds and carried about 10 years of things neither of them needed to say. Then she left. Naomi stood in the corridor and watched her go, and she thought about what it cost people to make even the smallest right choices, and how rarely those costs got acknowledged, and how much of the world runs on that uncredited currency. Marcus found her in the garden. She'd gone outside in the late afternoon, not because she had a task there, just because the estate gardens in October had a specific quality she'd always appreciated, the way they moved from riot to stillness, the year's work concluding in color and then letting go. She was sitting on the stone bench near the east hedge, coat on, hands in her lap, watching the light change on the far end of the lawn. He came and sat beside her without asking. He was off duty, civilian clothes, the large man somehow larger without the security architecture around him, the absence of the vest and the radio making him look younger and somehow more exposed. They sat in silence for a while. It was the kind of silence that had been earned. "I submitted my assessment," he said finally, "to Luciano. A full written account. What I saw Wednesday night. What I did Thursday. All of it." "I know," she said. "Warren told me. He's deciding what to do with it." "I know that too." A pause. "I might lose the post." "You might," she agreed. He nodded, slowly, like a man making peace with the horizon. "I keep thinking about what you said," he said, "about me having to live with it. And I've been thinking. I've been living with a lot of things, small things mostly, times I didn't say something I should have, times I chose the easier thing." He looked at his hands. "I think I got used to the weight of it. I stopped noticing I was carrying it." She looked at him. His profile, in the late light, had the quality of something old and honest. "I think that's true of most people," she said. "I think most people are carrying things they've stopped noticing. And then something happens that makes them feel the weight again, and they don't know what to do with it. What do you do with it?" She thought about that. She thought about Ida May's hands in her hair on Sunday mornings. She thought about a supply closet and a landline and a number she'd memorized because she was the kind of person who memorized important things. "I think you keep showing up," she said. "You keep making the next choice, and you let the weight of the old ones be the reason you choose better instead of the reason you stop choosing at all." Marcus was quiet for a long time. The light finished its change. The garden went from gold to gray in the way October light does, quickly, the way the day in that month concedes the field to the evening without much argument. "I'm glad you called him," Marcus said. "I'm glad you found a way." "You would have figured it out," she said. "By morning, you'd have gotten there." He looked at her. "You don't know that." "No," she admitted, "but I choose to think it." She stood up from the bench, brushing the cold from her coat. "Come inside. Bernard is making dinner. The real kind, not staff food. He's been at it since 3, and if nobody eats it, he's going to be genuinely insulted." Marcus looked up at her. "There it is," he said. It came out quiet, almost to himself. "There what is?" "You," he said. "Doing it again, taking care of people." She looked down at him. She thought about what he'd said, the recognition in it, and also the slight edge of something she needed to address. "Marcus," she said, "I'm going to dinner because I'm hungry and because Bernard's cooking is exceptional and because I've had a hard week and I would like to sit at a table with people I know and eat a good meal. That's for me." She paused. "The fact that it's also good for Bernard is extra." He looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. The specific release of a man who has been watching someone with worry and has just received, from that person, permission to stop worrying quite so hard. He stood up. "Okay," he said. They went inside. The dinner was not elegant. It was long and loud and slightly chaotic in the way of meals that happen when people who have been through something together finally sit down and let the tension finish leaving their bodies. Bernard had made too much food. Deliberately, she suspected. The overabundance of a man who expresses care through quantities. And the table in the staff dining room had been pushed together with 2 other tables to accommodate the 15 people who ended up staying. Danielle sat across from Naomi and kept looking at her with the expression of someone checking that a thing is still real. Philip, who'd had approximately the worst professional week of his 26-year-old life, ate 2 full plates of pasta and fell asleep briefly in his chair between the main course and dessert, which Bernard handled with the dignified discretion of a man who has seen things. Warren came late and sat at the far end and was quiet for most of the meal, but stayed until nearly the end, And at one point, Naomi caught him and Danielle having what appeared to be a surprisingly comfortable conversation about something that had nothing to do with the estate, and she thought about how rooms make people possible in ways that nobody plans. Luciano did not come to the dinner. She hadn't expected him to. He had his own reckoning to conduct, the calls he needed to make, the people in his actual professional world who required explanations for the sudden return, the architecture of a life that had just changed in ways that would take months to fully understand. She'd seen him briefly in the late afternoon crossing the main hall with his phone to his ear, and he'd caught her eye through the glass and nodded once. Not the decision nod, not the confirmation nod, just the acknowledgement nod. The one that says, "I see you, still here," she'd nodded back. It was after 10 when the last of them left the table. She stayed to help Bernard clean up. Not because it was her job, it genuinely wasn't. The kitchen had its own closing team. But because she'd been at the table for 3 hours and she wasn't ready to go back to her room, and she needed something to do with her hands. Bernard washed. She dried. It was a rhythm that established itself without discussion, the way practical things do when two people are comfortable enough to simply begin. They worked in silence for a while. The kitchen sounds, water, dishes, the settling of a large building going quiet for the night. "You're going to take the job," Bernard said. Not a question. "I think so." She dried a bowl, set it on the rack. "I'm going to negotiate the terms first." "Of course you are." He handed her a pot. "What's the condition you haven't told him yet?" She glanced at him. "Who said there's one?" "There's always one with you, the one you're still deciding on." She dried the pot. She thought about it. She thought about the narrow bed and the equipment shed window and the 4 years of living in a space that was given to her rather than chosen. "Housing," she said, "off property, my own apartment, not staff quarters, with a housing allowance as part of the package." Bernard nodded slowly. "You want a door that's yours." "I want to be able to leave," she said, "at the end of the day, to go somewhere that's mine. I think I need that." She paused. "I think I've needed it for a while and didn't let myself need it because needing things felt dangerous." "Needing things is dangerous," Bernard said. "Sometimes," she agreed, "but not needing things isn't safety. It's just a different kind of loss." He handed her the last pot. She dried it. She set it on the rack with the others. The kitchen was clean. Bernard untied his apron and hung it on the hook beside the door. The specific hook, the one he always used, the physical punctuation of a day finished. He turned off the overhead light, leaving only the low counter lights running for the overnight cleaning team. He looked at her in the dim. "You're going to be all right," he said. Not comfort, assessment, the statement of a man reporting what he observes. "I know," she said. "You were always going to be all right." "I know that too," she said. "I just needed to remember it." He nodded. He went home. He was one of the senior staff who lived off property, had for years, had his own apartment in New Haven, his own life that existed outside these walls. She watched him go with the specific feeling of someone who is learning to want what someone else has, and understanding, for the first time, that wanting it is not a betrayal of anything. She went outside one more time before bed. The grounds were quiet. The security rotation was running. She could see the slow sweep of a flashlight at the north perimeter, hear the distant crackle of a radio. The sky was clear the way Connecticut skies get in October when the humidity finally breaks, and the stars were out in the serious way, without apology, the way they appear when you remember to look. She walked the path along the east garden. She knew this path by feel, could have walked it in complete darkness, and known every turn, every stone, every place where the gravel gave way to grass. She stopped at the bench where she and Marcus had sat earlier. She sat down. She put her hands in her coat pockets. She looked at the dark outline of the estate against the sky. This enormous, complicated place that she had poured herself into for 4 years, that had taken everything she gave and never once formally acknowledged the giving. She looked at it without the specific pain of the past week and without the specific warmth of the earlier evening, just looked at it straight, the way you look at something when you're deciding what it actually is to you. It was a house. It was a lot of people. It was a place that had needed her and had gotten her, and in the process had become something she was bound to, and the binding was real even though the terms of it had been wrong. She thought about the job title on this folded paper in her pocket. She thought about the housing allowance she was going to negotiate. She thought about the staff council and the formal systems and the team that would maintain what she'd built, instead of leaving it on the shoulders of one person who was too stubborn and too afraid of being disposable to ever say it was too much. She thought about her grandmother, not with the sharp, specific grief of Wednesday night's cutting. That grief was still there. It would be there for a while. You don't lose 30 years of Sunday mornings in one night and recover in a week. But she thought about Ida May in the ordinary way now. The way you think about someone who shaped you, who is in the way you move through the world, who is permanent in you even when they are not present. Ida May had worked in other people's houses for 40 years, had cleaned and cooked and managed and organized and remembered everyone's names and everyone's needs, and done it all with the specific dignity of a woman who understood that the work was not the sum of her, even when the people she worked for assumed it was. She'd told Naomi once, she must have been 7 or 8, sitting at the kitchen table in Augusta while Ida May pressed her uniform for the following week, that the secret was knowing the difference between what you gave and what you were. That giving everything to your work was fine, as long as you never confused your giving with your worth. That the moment you let someone else's valuation of your labor become your valuation of yourself, you had handed them something they had no right to have. Naomi hadn't fully understood it at 8. She thought she understood it better now. She sat with the stars and the dark outline of the estate and the specific quiet of a Friday night that had survived its week, and she let herself be for a few minutes simply the woman she was, not the maid, not the invisible infrastructure, not the lesson someone learned, not the woman who stood in a ballroom and cut her own hair even when her hands were shaking. Just Naomi, 34 years old, tired in the bone-level way, alive in all the ways that mattered. Her hair was 2 inches long. It would grow. She knew that with the same certainty she knew her own name. Not because she was optimistic about it, but because she understood how things grow, slowly, from the root, without asking permission from the thing that tried to cut them. She stood up. She walked back toward the house, not rushing, not dragging, just walking at the pace of someone who knows where they're going and is not afraid of arriving. The east door was unlocked. She went inside. The staff corridor was dim and quiet, the building settling into its nighttime sounds. She stopped at her door. She put her hand on the knob. She thought about the apartment she was going to negotiate for. A small place, probably. A window that looked at something other than an equipment shed. A door she could close and know was hers. She would find it. She would furnish it slowly, the way you furnish a space when you're not in a hurry and you're done pretending you don't have preferences. She would have plants, probably. She'd always wanted plants but hadn't let herself invest in them in staff quarters because it felt too permanent, and she'd never been sure how permanent she was allowed to be. She was going to be permanent now, or as permanent as anything is, which is long enough to matter. She opened her door. She went inside. She turned on the lamp beside the narrow bed and she looked at the room that had been her home for 4 years. The small mirror, the single shelf, the window, and its uninspiring view. She looked at it like a person saying a measured goodbye. Not sentimental, not bitter, just accurate. She sat on the edge of the bed. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out the folded position paper and smoothed it on her knee. Director of Household Operations and Staff Welfare. She read the full description this time, all of it, the responsibilities, the authority structure, the reporting relationships. She read it with the careful attention of someone who is not going to sign anything without knowing what she's signing, even when she already knows she's going to sign it. It was good. It was mostly right. There were 3 things she was going to change in the negotiation, including the housing allowance, and 1 thing she was going to add that wasn't in the document, a formal line about the staff council's authority that she'd already drafted in her head on the walk back from the garden. She folded the paper again. She put it on the nightstand. She took off her coat. She took off her shoes. She lay back on the narrow bed for the last time. She knew it was the last time, even if the apartment was weeks away. Something had settled in her that made this particular resting place feel concluded. And she looked at the ceiling. The estate was quiet. The security rotation was running correctly. The kitchen was clean. The linen closets were stocked. The fire exit on the 2nd floor was no longer blocked by a misplaced cart. She'd confirmed that at 7 this evening without mentioning it to anyone, just moved the cart herself, 30 seconds of the old habit, because some things you do not because of strategy or symbolism, but because a fire exit should not be blocked, and you are standing right there. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Connecticut night did what October nights do, settled into itself, cooled towards something clear, let the stars do their old and patient work across a sky that was indifferent to the specific dramas of the people underneath it. And beautiful, anyway. Inside, in a narrow bed in a room that had held her for 4 years, Naomi Brooks breathed out, long and slow and complete. The breath of someone who has been carrying something enormous and has finally, genuinely, set it down. Not because someone made her, not because she failed, but because she chose to. Because she knew at last, in the deep and functional way of actual knowledge rather than aspiration, that she had never needed to carry it alone. She had simply never been asked otherwise. That was going to change now. She breathed in.